Well, you made it to the last chapter, chapter 8, in Music and Dance and Building a Relationship. We are going to talk about the evolution and the different styles of music. That's all this is dedicated to. It's a quick overview of this. Watch some other videos out there and you can get a lot more in depth, but it's just a quick snap picture so that way you can try to decipher maybe an era or style that a music was around, and that might then influence and inspire your dance as well. The main eras that we'll talk about are the Middle Ages, that last 1,000 years, the Renaissance, which lasts 150 years, the Baroque Era, 150 years, the Classical period, 75 years, Romantic period, 75 years, and the Contemporary or Modern Era, which is from the 1900s to the present. One of the things that you'll notice as we go through the different eras is the musical arc. It starts to speed up. The amount of time it takes to develop a new style of music gets closer and closer together until we're in our modern era, where music is a fusion and almost reinvented every week. The Middle Ages began around 450 Common Era and went to about 1450 Common Era. That's 1,000 years rounded. And mostly the music around that time was written for religious purposes. It's known as sacred music versus secular music, which is just any purpose. Sacred music is written for the divine or religious purposes in the church. It was mostly monophonic music. It was just a single line or melody, and Gregorian chant was one of the most common at the time. Because it was written as sacred music, virtually no composers got recognition. So any pieces that we have are mostly, say, anonymous. The Renaissance was from 1450 to 1600, lasting about 150 years. This is where we got more polyphony, and even though polyphony came out around 1200 in the Middle Ages, they started to develop it a lot more. Many instruments or more than one instruments playing at the same time. The music now became sacred along with secular and instrumental because the French court actually allowed music for entertainment purposes. For historical purposes, think about Columbus, Copernicus, and even Galileo. The Baroque Era, from 1600 to 1750, about 150 years, just like the Renaissance. This is where music and dance really start to develop. For movement, drama, and emotions become a big aspect of the arts. Mathematics contributes as well. The violin kind of steps to the center stage of the orchestra, and opera, where you combine music and theater, becomes a big aspect. Some big names of this era you should know are Bach, Handel, and Vivaldi. The Classical Era, from 1750 to 1825, the arc now gets smaller to 75 years. This is the Age of Enlightenment. Homophony becomes central to the orchestra. The natural becomes what's most known in the art world and in the music world, compared to the artificial from the Baroque world. Melodic expression with dynamics and instrumental color become a huge component in the music. Not only the timbre and the quality of the instruments, but also the piano becomes huge in the orchestra because of its dynamic quality of being able to get loud and soft. Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven are some of the biggest names you should recognize from this era. This is also the time of America's independence in 1776. The Romantic Era, from 1825 until 1900, another 75 years in the arc of music evolution. Melody dominates most of the pieces and becomes a central part. Unlike the Classical Era, which had stricter laws about balance and restraint, the Romantic Era moved away from that and allowed more freedom of expression and creativity with emotions and experimentation. Rubato is seen in most pieces, including ones that are more rhythmic. Some names you should know from the era are Chopin, Brahms, Tchaikovsky, and Strauss. The American Civil War was from 1860 to 1865. The modern era, from 1900s to the present, This is the part of the arc where music changes almost every decade, to every 5 years, and even then to every year now. With the use of electricity, music can now be reproduced, distributed, amplified, played on the radio, listened to all the time. And today, you can listen to unlimited music on a single device. You can use headphones so you can listen to music even in private areas. This is the era that broke all the rules of the previous years and eras. Impressionism, expressionism, instrumentation, neoclassicism, jazz, pop, electronic, rock. All these come out in the 20th century, and in the 21st century become even more fused. Some composers you should know of the 20th century are Aaron Copland, John Williams, James Horner, and Alan Menken. Yeah, that was an example of John Cage's piece 433. He did it in 1952, got up on stage, sat there for 4 minutes and 33 seconds while the audience was wondering what's going on, coughs, mumbling, open candy wrappers. He stood up and he said, there you go. An example of experimental music, experimental art, experimental anything. The good news is it's been done, and like most things we experiment with, we keep the good stuff that's good and that we like, and then we get out with the bad. So at least it's been done, but I would never pay money to go hear that. In that amount of time, you could even shave. Now let's have some fun and talk about some different musical styles through the 20th century. In the turn of the 20th century, rag was the big thing. Usually a straight rhythm with this kind of cut time feel. And what would happen is, usually playing around the States at the time, this music was done in brothels and saloons. Over time, they started to swing the rhythm a bit and even pick up the speed, and it was then known as stride. Then in the 1920s, we were introduced to blues and jazz. Blues typically a swing rhythm. And then we were also given the jazz style, which typically is a swing as well. With syncopated hits in the 1920s during Prohibition through 1933. It's a style of dance, I'm sure you know, the Charleston, but also the way the music sounded with syncopated hits. Jazz got fiery. Also, if you take the blues sound with a swing and just change up a little numbers, you can get the country kind of sound, which originally started still kind of bluesy, but in the 1930s and the 1940s, big bands started playing together along with combos started to play together. That's where you usually have this like drums, a bass, maybe a piano player, maybe a singer, a guitar player, usually 3 or 4 piece combos. World War II slowed things down a bit because everybody was overseas fighting or working in factories. But when they came back in the 1950s, we then were given rock, where they basically took the blues sound, but then they pumped it, usually with straight rhythm. Then, after rock was taking its place in the 1950s with guys like Elvis and Chuck Berry, doo-wop groups started coming together in the late 50s into the 60s. And doo-wop is what, to me, gave the birth of pop. So repetitive chords, that kind of four guys singing underneath a lamppost kind of sound. Okay, so doo-wop was then born, and then bands like Drifters and Platters came about and started singing their stuff. Around that time, also Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons came out and started mixing the rock with the pop and the doo-wop. A lot of different styles there. But in general, you can go ahead and break things down, kind of like what we did with the elements, and then you go inside the element, you can find the different components. Blues and jazz are pretty much their own little category, and then you can go inside and find different styles of jazz. You can go inside and find different styles of blues. Okay, same thing with rock. In the 1960s, we then had Motown, and that syncopated kind of chill beat, usually like. We then also had some music coming up from South America. A lot of stuff by Antonio Carlos Jobim, which is Latin style music, and bossa, which is built on syncopation again. So this sound right here. This sound. Music still in the 60s then, when it came to rock, started using that exact same sound. In the 1970s, we then were given disco, which is what today basically sounds almost like techno or house music, but that ABBA type music, Bee Gees, that usually has more to do with the drum kind of sound, but disco. And we also then were given like funk, and that's usually played based off of syncopation and sitting on one chord. Groove kind of came out around in the 60s a bit, even maybe a little bit in the 50s, depending on what you're looking at. But groove is where you had the bass line, and it would repeat itself a lot. So something like and through the whole song, the bass line would stay the same. So then in the 1980s, when we get a lot more electronic keyboards and electronic sounds that are being sampled and put in, we get electronic music. Electronic sounds provided such music as in the 1990s, then we get punk and grunge. Even the late 80s, a little bit in the 70s too, but 80s is also when we started to get rap, which is where there's basically just poetry, saying words in rhythm, in time, with a backtrack or with a beat. You then have categories such as hip-hop, R&B, underground, West Coast. New Age music comes out, and it's kind of a mix between classical and contemporary sounds. From the Caribbean, especially Jamaica, we get a style of music called reggae, where there is an accent on all the upbeats. Hoedown music has a very Western, cowboyish, out on the ranch dancing kind of sound. film inspired a lot of music, and music inspired a lot of film. If you listen to a lot of themes that John Williams does, from Jurassic Park and Star Wars, Indiana Jones, Harry Potter, you'll recognize those themes and motifs we talked about earlier, and you'll see that the movie is almost like an opera because it uses those themes whenever a character or a feeling or a place is brought up on screen or even thought or talked about. Especially in the late 80s, 1990s, Disney went huge, in a big part because Alan Menken, who I suggest you go ahead and learn about, came along and made all those songs for Beauty and the Beast, Little Mermaid, and Hunchback of Notre Dame, and virtually anything Disney, most of them. If we were looking for a difference in 21st century versus 20th century music, it's probably a lot like the food and art and everything nowadays. It's a fusion. Not much is really being invented, it's just being reinvented or combined. So kind of like Chinese food with tacos. Country music, if you listen to it, a lot of it sounds like pop with heavy accents, maybe a little bit of slide guitar. And then there's straight traditional country. So that fusion of different styles of music is what makes the mainstream and a lot of the great stuff that you maybe have never heard of a bit different. And it's mixing to form something new. But then at times too, like things are cyclical, it's also nice to go back to traditional style of stuff. So instead of it sounding like classical music mixed with techno, sometimes it's good then to just hear straight classical and straight techno. Hopefully these videos have taught you and inspired you enough to be able to put together your own playlist. So even on your Apple Music or anything, when you create your playlist, you will have songs that are in multiple playlists. You might have a song that you say, you know what, this is a good triple meter. And then you might say to yourself, you know what, also that piece though is reflective or peaceful. And you have a playlist called Reflective or Peaceful Music, and that same piece is in there. You might have a playlist that says Beyonce, but then also a playlist that says triple meters, and some of Beyonce's triple meter songs are in that playlist. Or a folder that says upbeat music, and some of Beyonce's music's in that folder as well. A folder that might say serious sounding music or minor, and you take some of the Beyonce songs that are serious and put it in that folder as well. So crossing over in your playlist a number of different songs. That way when you are choreographing or putting together a class, you then can go and pull up an idea you have from the playlist. And that way with the thousands of songs that are out there, they're a little bit more compartmentalized. I hope these videos helped explain a bit about how music works, about what it is, and about how you can use it to build that relationship between your dance and the sound that we hear. If you have any questions, please go ahead and put them in the comments. Thank you for watching, and good luck.